Good afternoon, everyone. And I would like, first of all, to thank the organizers of this conference for all the effort of putting this together in honor of Richard Leakey. And this is really a very special moment for reflect on these issues and to come up to see any way in which you can be able to honor and carry that legacy. And my presentation is a contribution from different colleagues that we work with in different sides, both in the east side and the west side of Lake Turkana. And when the name Richard Leakey is mentioned, it's not normally, you wouldn't quickly associate it with a later prehistory, more so of East Africa or Turkana Basin, because you'll only maybe consider it with associating it with a deep time, his paleoanthropology, the early hominids, early stone, all the early cell, the cool stuff, millions of years. But little is known that actually he did play a great role in encouraging research related to the later prehistory of Turkana Basin, mainly in various ways, by either encouraging or facilitating research, mainly focusing on the later prehistory of Turkana Basin. In the late 60s, early 70s, Larry Robbins was in Lothagam excavating sites that are associated with the Fisher hunter-gatherer sites in Turkana, and that laid the foundation of understanding the kind of the later prehistory that we have in Turkana Basin. On the east side, he was also very instrumental in facilitating David Philipson in excavating Lower Serra in the 70s, in just south towards Loyangalani, and later again in the early 70s in facilitating John Bartholomew in documenting the later prehistory on the east side, mainly Kobifora region, within the Kalana Boy beds, in which John Bartholomew was able to document the different kind of subsistence practices that are found within the last 10,000 years in Turkana Basin. So all these laid the foundation of the later prehistory in Turkana Basin that we see today in this landscape that is very resilient and is supporting very many pastoral communities in this area. So for myself, as my encounter, luckily, through different times when I was at the museum, but a very good encounter I remember is in 2008 during the Human Origins Conference in Ileret, in which Mzee, as he was fondly referred to all of us, as we fondly refer to him, to some of us, is because during this conference, he was able to pull us aside and actually told me no uncertain terms, like, you need to, in his own words, chukua na mikono yenu, hold the collaboration and have meaningful collaboration with colleagues in which you can be able to undertake your research and collaborate with the colleagues in a very meaningful way. So those are the words that I carry up today, that whenever I undertake any collaboration, that be meaningful and a very respectful way. And that, for me, is a very eye-opener that I carried up to today. So I study, my research that I present to you is about pastoralism, mainly maybe because part of the thing, I come from a pastoral community, so it's something that is very dear to me. But pastoralism is a very resilient subsistence practice globally, sustaining millions of livelihoods in different kinds of places across the world, in more fragile and very unstable landscapes. But some of these landscapes actually today, especially in Turkana Basin, is come under very much threat, is under threat. We did know from oil exploration, hydrocarbon extraction, wind power generation, and also the conservancies are getting everywhere. So threatening this age-old lively tradition and doubt, and this all is happening without long-term knowledge of pastoralist land use patterns. How do these pastoralists use the landscape? How can that inform the present challenges of conservation, oil extraction, and development? So all this actually is now the pressures that face the present-day pastoralist communities, mainly in Turkana Basin. So for this presentation, we look at we take a long-term perspective on climate change, and looking at the risks, human, economic, and cultural responses, and other the current environmental changes, for example, the lake level shifts and the effects on communities, especially in Lake Turkana, and then look at pastoralism as a resilient but a threatened way of life. we know that actually the last 15,000 years, the big questions that we ask, the climate has been changing very rapidly, and there's corresponding change in subsistence strategies associated with it. And one of the things that, what are the new knowledge and future research directions that we can able to incorporate as we understand these challenges of climate change through time? And what are the, especially with regard to the African humid period, and how did that affect hunter-gatherers and the inception of early pastoralists in Turkana Basin? And as my colleague, Dr. Sonia Hammond mentioned this morning, is about the effect or among the first things or the hallmarks of Turkana Basin is also having the earliest evidence of pastoralism in Eastern and Southern Africa. So it's a very key area. Among the first, the cradle of innovation, cradle of humankind, also the cradle of pastoralism, so, or the cradle of managed food production. So what is the relationship between the past and the present, especially having this knowledge about the past pastoral communities and the present day pastoral communities that inhabit this landscape? Mainly, we look at it from the last 10,000, the change in the Congo and the Congo rainfall belt, and it is able to move. As it's moved, it's created very dry, the wet, humid conditions. The lake level was very high, as physics can document from the different kind of site locations that are associated with among the early Holocene sites, about 10,000 years to about 6,000. And all these are very far off from the present lake, meaning the lake was very high and actually spilling over into the Nile drainage basin. So how did these people adapt to these conditions during the African humid period? About 15,000 years ago, as there was more rainfall, high lake levels, vegetation changes, especially the hunting and gathering communities. How was that? Conditions changed through time, and what are the human response to that time? And my colleague Stephen Goldstein actually has looked at it from a different perspective, analyzing the different archaeological and fauna remains that have been found at the site in Lothakam and Lokam, whereby he has created a very good change in subsistence analysis in the change of subsistence practices, looking at the local and regional environmental different environment fluctuates at different scales. And this is very important to understand as the environment changes, even at a place such as Lake Turkana Basin, there are these very localized microenvironments that are very key in terms of promoting the local resources. And therefore, this becomes very important as the environment changes and provides very good resilient or refuge for pastoral communities because of the little microenvironments that are available. So it was not uniform, but the role of these small microenvironments is very key. And shift in lithic technologies to respond to local changes and the cultural and technological innovation as they respond. And he was able to create this document the different kind of subsistence strategies that change through time in Lokam. One of the critical things also in Turkana Basin, especially relating to the later prehistory, is the burial of these megalithic, we call them pillar sites. These are megalithic structures that actually are the different areas across the landscape. And they are found within both the east side and the west side of Lake Turkana Basin, of the Lake Turkana. And we have studied these both in the east side and the west side, documenting very elaborate burial traditions that actually these sites were actually buried more than between 500 and 500 people actually buried in these. These important pillars in the landscape actually built by early pastoralists, showing the place of commemoration across the landscape. And they are very key, therefore, in trying to understand the pastoralist resilience and way of life in this dry, arid landscape. And because of the kind of archaeological ethics of not trying to expose the entire thing, some of the techniques they use is ground-penetrating radar to understand the burials. And we estimate there are about 500 to 1,000 burials that are available that are within this landscape. And there are many more in different designs and different shapes all across the landscape. And there are a lot of elements of ornamentation and aesthetics, especially in ostrich eggshells, ostrich eggshell beads. And these are not only, we don't look at them, but only as aspect of ornamentation, but also as aspect of social connection, creating social connection. And it goes beyond ostrich eggshell beads, whereby we have these very elaborately done stone beads using different raw material, Amazonite, quartz, Charles Sydney, among others. They are all very elaborately done and through time. And these are also found within these burial sites, showing that kind of form of very elaborate resilience that are utilized by these early communities. So from all this work, we have been able to understand what are the changes. We've been able to understand the different kind of locations of this site, both in the east side of this pastoral site, the east side and on the west side. And from that, we're able to understand now what are the future directions that we want to take in terms of understanding pastoral mobility. And we look at pastoral mobility in 3 dimensions. One of the dimensions is human mobility, trying to understand how people move across the landscape. And my colleagues in Anneka Jensen are using strontium isotopes to understand how humans, from tooth enamel, to understand how humans move across different geological provinces, or as light isotopes to understand how they move across different environments. We also look at livestock mobility, a movement of livestock across different geological provinces, a bit more so cows, goat, and sheep, and then material mobility. And in regard to human mobility, then we look at the teeth and how they're able, because they are able to capture that kind of, up to the age of 13, about the different kind of landscape that people are taking and bringing water from. We also look at livestock mobility in terms of where the livestock are going across and grazing, understanding the different kind of environments, across different geological provinces that we can able to understand. And here I compare data from different, this is from modern pastoralists, the use of the landscape, and then we'll see how it compares with that of human beings. And this is human mobility, official dietary variation in diet, and how they kind of try based on strontium isotopes. And these are the kind of directions that we want to understand the different mobility. Because the big question that we are trying to understand, how was pastoralism initiated in Turkana Basin? It was within a background of increased climatic variability, where the environment was wet, it was very increasingly dry, and it's unclear on whether the early pastoralists were new populations that moved into Turkana Basin, or was it the original hunter-gatherers that actually shifted their subsistence practices and started practicing pastoralism? Or was it a mixture of both? Understanding these questions are critical in able to understand today's challenges that are actually facing the pastoral communities across the landscape. So we also look at material mobility, and some of the work that I've done is actually obsidian sourcing, understanding the different sources of obsidian and matching it to the archaeological finds and the geological sources and the archaeological artifacts that are found within the Holocene sites. And some of them actually point at very different sites that have been going all the way to Ethiopia, as we'll see shortly. Then other kind of material is clay sourcing. We need to understand the pottery, the ceramic tradition, starting from 9,000 up to 3,000 of the late Holocene. Where are these, is there changes in terms of the ceramic sourcing? Where are they getting this clay from? Are they new materials that are coming in, or are they coming in and finished products? This on understanding this kind of exchange networks is critical in understanding whether these were aspects of exchange networks existing across the landscape, or it's just a matter of ranging patterns moving across the landscape in wider areas, as opposed to just getting the things when they are finished products. So those are some of the things we're doing, and the data from obsidian sourcing actually shows that we have different sources. Some of the sources are in the Suguta Valley South, some are within the Ethiopian highlands. And when we plot those sources, we find actually that they match some of the sources that can match the sources in Ethiopia, some match sources way far south as far as 250 kilometers. So there's a wide range in terms of obsidian. So the next thing that we are going to do is to analyze the clay sourcing, and that's the project we are going to undertake this coming summer, to be able to understand the different kind of clay sources that exist. Because we look at this in terms of to understand the distribution of sites as a way of building resilience and risk avoidance. And when we look at this in terms of the lake distribution, we have these upwelling areas. And if you look at the archaeological distribution of these archaeological, if we look at the distribution of these archaeological sites, you find that they fall within those kind of called the upwelling areas. And it's within these upwelling areas that actually we find that. And we compare that with this is modern pastoralist use of the landscape. And this is based on a GPS livestock across they move the landscape. So these upwelling areas become very critical areas in terms of providing not only fishing grounds, but also good ground areas for grazing. And now coming back to the modern pastoral communities, we look at them now to also to understand how can we be able to understand the coupled and natural systems, how the natural affect the human and how the human affects them. So we look all of this in totality, trying to understand issues of wealth, precipitation, water availability, foraging among biomass, and how that integrates affecting the humans, among the carrying capacity, stock numbering, residential mobility, among other things, and energetics. So we bring this together to look at all now from a human health point of view, understand, for example, the water insecurity, how and the high temperature and water issues, how does that affect the community, the health of the community living in this dry marginal landscape, and how in terms of also energetic, the energy expenditure during the day. So we are looking at it from that total point of view in terms of how the natural and the cultural affect one another. And from this, we can be able to understand what are these changes that affect human health as things are changing, and is there any other inference, evidence of environmental change. So here, we also integrate in local ecological knowledge and the understanding pastoralist mobility. And the map here is different areas that are utilized by the Dassanach community in the east side of Lake Turkana, whereby they demarcated the landscape showing the different areas that they use during the wet season, the dry season, at the extreme dry season when it's very dry. More recently, as I said, we GPS the animals and we are able to track their movements across the landscape. You well know more recently, we have had a very severe drought. We just emerging from a very severe drought, and pastoralists lost of livestock. And from that, we only had one herder who had one of our GPS livestock, and he was the only one whose cows did not die. We lost all the cows that we had GPSed, but only this one herder is the one that we did not lose his cows. So when we retrieved the GPS and plotted the data, we found actually that during all this time, most of his time is the one in reddish. He spent it way out in the volcanic margins, way outside the basin. And when we compare that with the local traditional knowledge in grazing patterns, we find that actually those are the areas that are listed as areas that you can graze during very dry time, that when things are really bad. And that is the only way that he was able to keep his livestock and come back. That the issues of inter-community violence and struggles notwithstanding, he was able to have his livestock, his cows, as opposed when everyone else completely lost their livestock. So this knowledge, understanding the knowledge and the livestock is key, especially when we go now to issues, as I mentioned at the beginning, when we get into issues of extraction of resources within this landscape, emergence of conservancies, among other things. So it's critical that we understand. And we have that long-term knowledge of pastoralists, right? Resilience and use of the landscape from the archaeological record, moving that into into the future. It is from this, therefore, that we look at it as we reflect on Mzee's life. We look at the infrastructure he was able to put together, starting from actually the National Museums of Kenya. Actually, I was really touched the other day when Louise, in her presentation, showed the beginning of these offices that we hold today, when they were under construction. And the record and how consistently Mzee has continued building infrastructure. Kobifora Base Camp, it is there today supporting research. Now, notwithstanding, we are Turkana Base Institute in Ileret. In these very remote areas and very, very challenging areas to do research, there is infrastructure. So the goal as we continue building, as we honor Mzee in his legacy, whatever, it's important that we build infrastructure to support research, both in terms of technology transfer, capacity building, that we are able to support research. Not only, you can't be doing cool research, but when it is not, it's not supported by infrastructure to support that research on the ground, but not having infrastructure miles and miles away. And that is something that we learned very well during the pandemic, that we were actually able to graduate 3 PhD students who are able to undertake their research data collection remotely, just because of the infrastructure, the resources they had invested on some infrastructure and capacity building at the museum, and we were able to collect the data, consult on day-to-day basis with them, and they collected the data, finished up their dissertation under very difficult circumstances. So as we honor Mzee, we remember this infrastructure and this legacy of building infrastructure that we can be able to continue. Therefore, as we look at this pastoralist resilience and risk mitigation involved, issues of intensification, the diversified subsistence bases, as we see from pastoral communities, from fishing, hunting and gathering, and also keeping their livestock against these new changes, social connections, as we see from the 10 different of ornamentation, as mentioned, very important, local ecological conditions. On a wider level, there were these present challenges, actually climate change, call for a clear understanding of mechanism of resilience, risk mitigation, cultural conduct influence, and change through time. These mechanisms are relevant today, and they were in the past, and continue to play a critical role in what is increasingly multicultural and globally connected society. Asanteni sana.